So, hello everyone, and welcome to this conversation on the Summit for the Future and related issues. I'm Richard Kinley, the president of FOGS, and it's my privilege to chair this conversation today or to moderate our discussion. Um, for those of us in our UN community, I would say, who cherish the promise of the United Nations and the promise of the Charter, UN Day always has a special meaning, a moment of reflection. Some years we can experience feelings of satisfaction or even celebration. Other years, though, one are more of concern or even despair. For 2024, I think we can take some satisfaction from the outcome of the recent summit and with the adoption of the Pact for the Future, which we'll be discussing in a moment. But personally, I have to admit that the horrible criminal wars that are currently raging and the multilateral system's continuing inability to adequately come to grips with the long list of economic, social, and environmental crises that you all know too well, and which are destroying global resilience. These facts of 2024 cast, for me, a dark shadow over UN Day this year. However, that so many of you have joined the discussion today gives me hope that our community, people who care about the United Nations and about multilateralism, a community you might call hopeful multilateralists, that we're ready to spare no effort to turn around this ship, what the event's title refers to as the Titanic, and perhaps to launch some rafts or a raft for the future. So our event today is in two parts. One session will look at the Pact for the Future, and one will look at UN institutional reform, reform of the Security Council, but also that is the Security Council for Peace and Security issues, but also that lacuna of institutional capacity to deal with major economic, social, and sustainability issues that are confronting our world. A quick word at the outset about timing. I plan to end our event today on time as promised. So in 2 hours, we'll have about 1 hour, 1 hour and a bit for the first session, after which we'll switch to the second session, which will be about 45 minutes, and then some final words before we adjourn punctually at 5 o'clock in Europe, 11 o'clock, I believe, in New York, etc. So the format for both of these sessions will be the same. We'll begin with an opening presentation on each of the two topics in each session from a group of young researchers, associates, and researchers from FOGS who are drawn from all continents. And these young voices, new voices, I might say, will kick things off in what is a symbolic suggestion of FOGS's commitment to future generations. And these will then be followed by a number of experts who have registered to make some introductory comments. And that will set us up for a discussion which will follow. The comments of the experts are to be limited, and I would really emphasize this to 3 minutes so that we can hear from as many people as possible in the allotted time. And I am looking forward to both to the presentation and the comments, but then also the discussion, which will come in each session. We at FOGS like to think of ourselves as not just a think tank, but a think and do tank. And in that sense, we're not so interested in rehashing the debates of the last 2 years that led up to the Summit for the Future. Rather, what we'd really like to see or to hear as people who want the UN to succeed, to be a place of justice, of peace, and of sustainability, let's today try to put the focus on what do we do now? We have the Pact for the Future. How do we move forward? What can civil society, what can organizations like those we represent do? And what do we see governments doing to advance the outcomes in the Pact for the Future? And I would invite you all to be as concrete and specific in your comments as possible, as well as brief. So without further ado, I would now like to invite the group of FOG's associates and researchers to introduce themselves and to introduce our first discussion segment, which is on taking forward the Pact for the Future.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Branson Gillespie, and before the team and I further introduce ourselves, I just want to start with a brief overview of just what the Pact of the Future is, just so we're all on the same page. As we state, the Pact is an intergovernmentally negotiated document that was agreed upon at the Summit of the Future. The Pact is made up of 5 chapters, as you can see here. Additionally, it has 2 annexed documents, the Global Digital Compact and the Declaration on Future Generations. The Pact consists of a total of 56 actions covering these various different topics. So since the adoption of the Pact of the Future, we've spent the past few weeks researching and monitoring the reactions of member states, government officials, and other experts from across as much of the world as possible, given our own background in research areas, which I'll let everybody expand upon in just a moment. We've tried our best to capture and categorize our findings from member states as best we could, according to the categories we thought best to use. So with that, I'll start with introduction from myself. My name is Branson Gillespie. I'm originally from Kentucky, here in the US. I study international relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C., and I focus on the role of governance, politics, and society, and the role it has in international relations. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass over the mic to Eleonora.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eleonora. I'm from Italy. I'm studying as a postgraduate at Johns Hopkins SAIS here in Bologna, and my research focuses on climate change and security. I now pass the word to my colleague Yuga.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to participate in the whole session. Here is Yuga from Japan. I'm a student at the University of Tokyo, majoring in peace building studies, particularly in Bosnia and Myanmar. And now I'm in charge of the East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific in this research project. Glad to see you all. So let's press the button over to the Julie.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Okuma, a sophomore at the International Christian University in Tokyo. I will be majoring in peace studies and anthropology. I research Asia and the Pacific regions the same as Yuga. I will cover Security Council reform today. I am very glad to give a presentation today. Hand it over to Manam.
Hi everyone, good evening, good day to wherever you are. I'm a FOGS research associate and I'm from India. Passing it on to Lerato.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Lerato Tsebe. I am in Pretoria in South Africa. I am about to start my second year of my master's at the University of Johannesburg. I am associated with the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation, where I'm also a research associate, and my main interests in my studies are about Africa, peace and security, the United Nations, and international relations. I now pass over to my colleague, Jonathan.
Everyone, my name is Jonathan. I am originally from Brazil. I have lived my whole life basically in Russia, where I studied in Druden University. My main research are focused on peacekeeping operations and Brazilian foreign policy. I pass it on, I guess, to Branson.
Great, thank you, guys. So we'll go ahead and let Eleonora take over for this section of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Branson. So as briefly mentioned before, we will cover the general reaction to the Pact of the Future. We divided the countries in 3 groups. So I would like to let you know that the list of countries is not exhaustive, but nevertheless, we try to divide them in 3 groups, covering positive reaction, neutral or guarded reaction, and finally in group 3, negative and skeptical reaction. So starting from positive reaction, we can see from the map of the world that the pact has been received with positively by countries all across the world. So for example, from the Americas, we have Canada and Jamaica supporting the pact. From Europe, we have countries like France or the United Kingdom. From the African country, we have Namibia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Egypt. As example, from the Middle East of the support of the pact, we have countries like Oman and Iraq. From Asia, Philippines and Japan. From the Pacific and the Oceania, we can see islands like the Fiji Island and Micronesia, while from the Oceania, we have the support of Australia and New Zealand. These are just few examples of the type of support that has been expressed from the countries. Also, for example, we have the US supporting the pact as a significant step toward strengthening and evolving the United Nations. From South Africa believes that the pact is a step necessary for the implementation of the UN 2030 agenda and the Africa's agenda in 2063. While other countries like the Philippines and Australia praise the pact as being a good example of functioning multilateralism in the current system. Now I pass the word to Yuga.
Okay, I'll take the button to explain about group 2 and 3. Next slide, please. Okay. This slide shows a grid of the countries in a neutral or guarded perspective. Overall, as we can see from the list, for example, the grid 2 have the countries Mexico, Barbados, the Bahamas, El Salvador, Panama from Americas, and Sweden, Albania, Switzerland, Slovenia from Europe, and also Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon from Middle East, and Maldives from Asia, and Tonga, Palau, Samoa, Solomon Islands from the Pacific, and New Zealand from Oceania. Please move on to the next slide, please. Okay. These are the few examples of the quotes. To sum up, while expressing slightly the supportive standing, those countries are guarded due to the general concerns about the feasibility and the decisive will beyond commitments. As New Zealand, Barbados, and Albania pointed out, the pact may lack political will and commitments to fill the challenges. Also, Tonga, on behalf of the Pacific Islands Forum, recognizes the pact is positive impetus, but not perfect. Please move on to the next slide. Okay, thank you. Here we see the countries reacting negatively or skeptically to the pact. They're mainly skeptical of the deficiency of the crucial mechanism to strengthen the multilateralism in a realistic way, including vulnerable countries to be negotiated. As you can see, we have the countries like the Colombia, Cuba, Chile, Argentina, Lazio from Americas, and also Republic of Ireland, North Macedonia, Slovakia, Estonia from Europe, and also Ilan Qatar from Middle East, and also now Papua New Guinea from the Pacific. Next slide, please. Okay. As an overview, the countries in this group react to the pact as an unrealistic or non-universal or non-specific agenda. For example, Ilan points out that the pact fails to remove the root cause of the violations of international law due to the lack of the tangible mechanism going forward. Under perspective, Argentina and Ireland call the pact the superficial solutions, not reflected by reality, and not be able to go beyond the words. Particularly in terms of the climate change, now doubts whether the urgent need to address climate change will actually be fulfilled without the specified indicator here, as one of the most vulnerable countries in the front line against the sea level rise. Thank you. For the next section, I'll hand it over to Manam. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So in the next section, we're looking at what proposals some countries came up with or some comments on the concrete actions that are laid out in the pact. So here we have divided the countries according to which chapter they focused on. This is not very mutually exclusive. There are a few countries which commented or proposed some things to do with multiple chapters, but we also had some countries who don't really talk about the actions directly at all, and so you'll see that it's not all countries, it's as many as we could cover and as many as really spoke out. So yes, these are the 5 divisions that we had according to the chapters. And Branson, yeah. So for the first chapter, the focus was on sustainable development and financing for development actions. This was quite popular with many countries talking about it across Europe, Spain, Italy, Malta, from Asia, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka and India, the Pacific, Caribbean islands, small islands talking about it, Micronesia, who are really worried about the sustainable financing that is required. And from Africa, we had Egypt, and from Middle East, yes, we had Jordan, Iran, Iraq. And then on to some specific quotes that we have from the countries. I want to bring your attention to 2 of them, which actually have some very concrete actions. One being Solomon Islands, which said that the SDG-linked financial instruments, and they were urging global institutions such as the World Bank and IMF to bring innovative debt relief solutions, such as debt for SDG swaps. And then we had Malaysia, which said that they should strive for a green development pact that robustly addresses the scientific and technological divide between the global north and the global south, supported by financing and other development assistance projects. Majorly, countries also spoke in very general terms. For example, Austria said a new focus on achieving the SDGs and accelerating climate commitments as what this pact is about. And I pass on to Lerato and Branson the next. Yeah.
Thanks, Manan. We are going to be discussing the chapter now on science and innovation. On the, which is actions 28 to 33. The chapter essentially focuses on leaving no one behind as we continue to move into, the 4th industrial revolution and or migrating more and more towards artificial intelligence. The intentionality of the actions are to seize opportunities that are presented by technology and innovation, to scale up the means of implementation to developing countries, to deepen partnerships, with relevant stakeholders, specifically within the international financial sectors. And buttressing all of these is an emphasis on gender inclusivity in ensuring that we leave no one behind. One of the more interesting points that was made, or recommendations that was made or ways forward, was coming from Tonga, out in the Pacific Islands, which said that they wanted to develop an Ocean of Peace declaration that would further emphasize the commitment in advancing peace within the region in support of a rules-based and international order to peaceful resolution and disputes. Sorry, that was the incorrect slide. the Samoans, in Samoa, they wanted to be able to bridge this digital gap, and they want to be able to improve sectors that are vital to their communities and to enhance best practices, mitigate risks, and to be able to establish an SIDs or centers of excellences for the scientific community. I will now pass on to my colleague, Branson.
All right, great job, guys. Thank you. So I'll now take a look at some of the global responses we highlighted to Chapter 4, which focuses on youth and future generations. The Pact itself lays out 4 actions related to this topic. They include investment in young people, promoting, protecting, respecting the human rights of young people, strengthening youth participation at the national level, and strengthening youth participation at the international level. And of course, here's a highlight of countries from across the world that we found that talked about this. Oh, there we go. Okay. So as a young person, thanks to FOGS, I had the opportunity to travel to the UN for the Summit of the Future Action Days. Here I had the opportunity to attend 2 side events that focused on Chapter 4 and the Declaration of Future Generations. Both Jamaica and the Netherlands discussed the need to safeguard the future for young people and generations that are not yet born. While of course this also involved discussions around climate, protecting the economies and ensuring it also involved discussions around protecting economies and ensuring jobs across industries continue to exist for young people and people yet born. I also had the opportunity to hear from the devolved government of Wales through their Future Generations Commissioner. Wales was the first government anywhere in the world to implement such a thing. And this was not only a way to hear about how regional governments are able to play a role in multilateralism, but also the importance of institutionalizing the protection of future generations. Next, look at Chapter 5. So another way to help meet the needs of future generations and address all the other actions we've talked about is to transform global governance to make it possible. Many member states discussed this section and called for future negotiations on the structure of UN reform. And here's again the list across the world. One common theme I discovered across many countries in the Western Hemisphere, and I'm sure my colleagues did on theirs as well, is further negotiations needed on this front. Even many of the countries that holded negative or skeptical views of the Pact did so because of the lack of meaningful reforms from the Pact. And they continue to call for much needed change. These include strengthening ECOSOC, revitalizing the General Assembly, reform of the international financial architecture, and strengthening multilateralism across the board. So with that, we'll take it back to the chair for the next section or discussion.
Richard, you're on mute.
Sure, is your microphone.
Sorry about that. Thanks, everybody. Thanks in particular to our presenters who've given us a really good, I think, overview of the Pact and provide then a foundation on which we can now dig a bit deeper. And in that direction, I would now call on a number of people who have indicated their interest to help us by making some introductory comments. The first person I would call is Gonzalo Barón from the Transnational Institute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, Georgios, and all the bunch of young researchers that did a very nice job. Congratulations to Fox for this initiative. Of course, I guess that this is the future, indeed, of multilateralism. I'm bringing some ideas in this short time from the civil society perspective, and I could say a kind of a critical civil society perspective, because as our colleagues pointed before, there are kind of optimistic perspective of what the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future is, and that this is mostly the civil society that was engaged with the official process. Most of them part of the C4UN coalition, and that is a good-willing coalition, let's say, but sometimes was too critical of the process as it was. And of course, as they were involved so much into the official process, they have to cheer the outcomes of the summit. No? So in that regard, yeah, it's okay, but they lost a bit of the critical eye that many even states brought to the scene. From our perspective, and I'm kind of representing a group of organization networks and social movements that gather in New York, but we have been working on multi-stakeholderism and the corporate capture of the UN system. We have mixed emotions, let's say. On the one hand, the Pact for the Future, and mostly the Pact for the Future, kind of block the will of the SG in moving forward with the multi-stakeholderism agenda as it was proposed in our common agenda, no? And in that regard, thanks to the activism of the civil society, but mostly from developing states, that was blocked. And in that regard, it was a small victory because in the Pact for the Future, you don't have that at all. You still have the private sector present, but in another way, quite before, I'll say, quite less present than it could have been. But at the same time, today we are releasing, as a suggestion by Georgios, a statement that links the failure of the multilateral system as it's seen in the case of the genocide in Palestine. And I guess that this crisis that is impacting in the whole system was seen in the outcome of the Summit of the Future that was so frustrating for many of us. So our main feeling, our main thought is that we have to do a lot. We won't have opportunities as this one to try to deepen, but it's clear that we have to engage in bringing proposals, ideas on how to revamp, renew, or transform radically the multilateral system, because the way it is, and that was what the Summit of the Future brought, won't take us to the solutions for the planet and the peoples, as we said. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I hope we'll hear more about the kind of proposals you were speaking about that are needed now to move forward with the dealing with the problems that multilateralism is facing. Our next speaker is Eliana El Haba from the Coalition for the UN We Need.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, Eliana, we can.
Okay, I'm in a busy place. Just wanted to make sure. Having me here today, to say based on what we just discussed. First thing, it was mentioned and we all know it, but I believe that there was too much work and effort and consultations that were done about 2 years to come up with the pact as it is right now. And even if there's no, maybe at some point we feel that it's not as ambitious as we wanted it to be. But there's still room for, there's still some hope in it, and there is still room for taking it to the grassroots level and work on it, maybe each country individually or each community individually to make what's in that pact happen. But it's super important and keep
Eliana, you're breaking up a bit. I wonder if perhaps you could turn your camera off, and then we get perhaps more chance of hearing your uninterrupted voice.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. All right, so yeah, I was saying that the mapping of the countries and keeping tracking of countries' reaction and the work that they are doing. For example, just to mention as an example that you mentioned Brazil's position as neutral or skeptical, while on the other hand, there was a position from Brazil about like supporting the UN Charter reform, and that's interesting to keep an eye on and what's changing or like what are the different perspectives. One another thing to add is I'm not going to say that there is a mechanism in place yet, at least from our side, since I'm here representing C4UN, but I can say that it's very important to put some mechanisms in place to monitor this work and what was mentioned in the pact and what are the actions and what are the commitments that will of it. And maybe the last thing is that we all know that international law and multilateralism is facing so many challenges today, maybe more than ever. But I guess that it's important to reiterate today that regardless all these challenges, that does not make it less important, actually makes it more important than ever to stick to multilateralism and international law and wherever diplomacy can bring solutions to the table. So yeah, I guess that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliana. I was particularly struck by your second point about the need for accountability or transparency of implementation of what was agreed. And I think this is a quite important role of many international civil society organizations, but also domestically, because national governments need also to be held to account for what they have said they would do. And I think across many domains, this can be done much more effectively. Then our next speaker will be from the South Center, Danielle Uribe. Daniel, you need to unmute.
I thought I already did. Thank you very much again for your opportunity and for the opportunity to be here. I thank you very much for the interesting discussion that you presented. And I think that something which is quite clear is that there is a need to strengthen the political will coming from states. Even though there were certain positive outcomes or at least positive views about what the Summit of the Future might entail, particularly for future generations, there are still certain elements that require recalculation of where the United Nations is going and how should it go. We have seen that the moment in which the Summit of the Future was discussed or was being discussed, and actually the Pact of the Future was adopted, we were seeing certain issues around the world that were completely tumultuous. And this has increased the need for us to consider how we want to see the role of the United Nations going forward in the future. There are certain elements that require more attention. We are now moving from the COVID crisis to the debt crisis to the climate change crisis to a peace crisis that we need to foresee, and we need to reconsider the engagement that the developing countries should have in the United Nations. And I think that is one of the major parts that the Summit of the Future should have been, and also one of the outcomes that the Pact of the Future should have identified, which is a more diverse way of taking decisions in the United Nations, not only considering certain elements that came from the past, but also looking at how to strengthen the possibility of having, for example, a democratic control of certain decisions taken by the Security Council. There was and there has been certain considerations on the matter, and the United Nations have more or less considered them in the past, but without any kind of compromise. Now we have to see back if the United Nations that we are seeing now, the United Nations that the world is requiring now, the United Nations that future generations want to see in the future, is the same United Nations that was created in 1945, or it requires a more strengthened role where we see other participants beyond what we have as the normal stakeholders. We have seen that with the engagement of technologies, with the reduction or limitations of the physical space with digital technologies, we could actually not just stop the digital divide, but also increase the participation of civil society from the ground and look at the United Nations and the role of the United Nations on the ground. So these are some elements that were just superfluous discussed during the Pact of the Future, but we consider that the Pact of the Future can be a good setting stone for the reform of the United Nations in the future. And that is something that we want to strike as again and highlight, that the Summit of the Future should not be the only outcome of the discussion. It should be just the starting point of further change in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. I think some of these points we'll come to in our second part of the conversation today. But I really I took away from your remarks the real importance of political will and the challenge we face in mobilizing political will for the kind of solutions that we would hope could be multilaterally agreed. I have another speaker next, Maria Rodriguez from FEPS.
Thank you very much, and really greeting your initiative, as well the input coming from the young researchers. I think this stake talking is really important. I'm speaking now from Brussels. I'm chairing a foundation of the European Union, and we also were involved in all the process to prepare the Summit of the Future. So in telegraphic terms, we have a positive assessment of the final outcome. We think this is visible progress. It was also important to have a large majority supporting the pact in the initial vote, and a small group resisting to the pact. I think this was extremely meaningful regarding global situation. But we can also identify difficulties for the multilateral system to come up with the stronger instruments to act, and also difficulties to make the system more inclusive and more representative. This was also visible. If I go to the three of the main areas of the pact, the next generation was also a call to count on more powerful foresight systems to identify global challenge in the long term and to draw conclusions. And the language adopted was weaker than the one proposed initially. This is one example of this resistance and difficulty I'm referring to. On the digital agenda, it was positive to articulate for the first time a comprehensive multilateral agenda for the digital. Nevertheless, we can see again difficulties to build up real multilateral institutions to drive the digital transformation. And my last point is about SDGs, the implementation and finance, because this was indeed a very important part of the negotiation of the pact. There is detailed language, but there is an issue which is not clear, and perhaps we discuss this again in the second part of the meeting, is how to elevate the importance of the environmental pillar, and how to reflect the entire SDGs agenda in stronger United Nations institutions. How to upgrade the ECOSOC, so we're coming back to our discussion on the Resilience Council, how to have a real executive council with the capacity to drive the relevant agencies, and to have a strong interface with Bretton Woods and WTO, and to make sure that when member states implement national plans, they are properly supported at global level. this is not clear enough. And so we need more work. Of course, I know that we will have an important conference on financing for development and the summit on social development. But definitely, I think that in the second part of this meeting, we should come back to this issue because we see that we still don't have the clear multilateral framework to implement SDGs. So this is my comment.
Thank you. Very helpful comments, I think, in identifying areas that need more attention. And we'll come to some of them, as you said, in the second round. I'd now like to open the floor for anyone else who'd like to come in with some observations. And I would reiterate again, I think what could be useful for the conversation today is drawing from the Pact, what are the areas you think should be prioritized, or what can be given, where is their greatest promise if time is invested in moving the agenda forward? So some concrete suggestions that would allow others then to organize their work and to support member states or in other ways try to drive the agenda forward. I know someone in the crowd who's very opinionated, and I think he's dying to say something, and that's our good friend Yorgos Kostakos. Yorgos, perhaps you could give us some thoughts on this.
Richard, there is a hand. Perhaps you cannot see Jeff Huffines from Coalition for the UN We Need. He has raised his electronic hand, so he can go first if you want.
Yes, very sorry. I'm
and Mariana Burns,
moving across multiple screens for a technologically challenged person is always complex. So the first one I see is Mariana, I think, and Jeffrey. All right, so Mariana and then Jeffrey.
Okay, thank you very much. I work with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and I have two comments. One on the value of this summit. In a side event during the Action Days, we used songs to describe what's going on or what the summit is. First, for the negotiations, somebody took the Beatles and said it has been a long and winding road. And this is because we had the modalities resolution asking for consensus, right? And so in the end, as for the result, somebody quoted the Rolling Stones saying, you can't always get what you want. So what we have is a minimum consensus, really. And I think we need to take this into account. It's a lowest common denominator because of that requirement, consensus. But at the same time, I think the value of the pact is that a large majority of the member states actually agree with this vision of an inclusive and networked and therefore more effective multilateralism. But of course, this needs a lot of interpretation. And as we have seen with this excellent analysis of your students, we see some diversion when it comes to the reactions to the pact. For some, it's not enough, by far not enough. And for some, it's already way too much, right? Some countries like Argentina, President Milei speaks of world government, the UN taking over. So for them, it's way too much. And so that's for the next step. I think we have to work on the interpretation of the language that we have in the pact and try to shift the discussion in the right direction. And the pact itself says for the implementation, we should use all relevant fora. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to use all the upcoming COPs and FFD4, the World Summit on social development and all the other meetings to interpret the pact in the way we think it should be interpreted. all the way up to September 28, when we will have the formal review of the implementation of the Pact. And since we don't have a mandate for an SG report assessing the implementation in the Pact, it's up to us to bring up our own assessments where we are with the interpretation of the Pact by that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. I think that's a great point about various members of the community today keeping an eye and keeping governments honest. Next, we have Jeffrey and then Renata.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm Jeffrey Huffine, Senior Advisor to the Coalition for the UN We Need based in New York. And Richard, I really appreciate this presentation by Foggs and its intergenerational focus. Marianne, she cited the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. You know, us baby boomers, we grew up with that music, but maybe some of our young researchers will find examples from, you know, more recent vintage in the cultural scene. But that being said, I really do want to kind of piggyback on what a couple of points that Marianne had made, and in particular, the through line of the 2028 review of the Summit of the Future in the 83rd session of the General Assembly. You know, in terms of the sequencing of events, it's interesting to note, of course, that in 2027, there will be the SDG Summit that would begin the official kind of conversation about the acceleration of the 2030 agenda, the achievement of the SDGs by 2030, but also beginning to discuss the post-2030 framework. So we find kind of a repetition of the cycle that we experienced last year and this year in terms of the SDG, the Summit of the Future following the SDG Summit. So, I mean, as Marianne had mentioned, in reference to what she was mentioning, our information clearinghouse team is developing a typology of the commitments made from the 56 actions of the Pact for the Future to begin to map out a framework, if you will, for monitoring and review to ensure accountability on the part of member states and all stakeholders in the implementation of the Pact. And, you know, when you take a look at the actions, there are a number of actions that make reference to already existing mandated processes that are in play. And so this is obviously something that we will want to monitor and focus on. We will want to ensure that the actions that have been in the commitments made in the Pact are referenced in the subsequent events and the intergovernmental process. Next year, we know, of course, we have the fourth FFD conference, we have the World Social Summit, we have the review of the Peace Building Commission, among other events. And so during these next 4 years, we will want to make sure that the Pact commitments are reflected in subsequent agreements and that the actions to be taken are actually implemented in each opportunity. But for us, our focus is going to be on really also developing the framework that Marianne mentioned in terms of developing a report, if you will, that will assess the achievement of the Pact during these next 4 years through 2028. Back to you, Richard. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I think all of us will look forward to seeing that mapping that you spoke about, and also to the assessment, because I know from my long experience in the climate world that governments are all too keen to sign up to ambitious pledges, but less keen on doing anything about them. So I think that the extent to which we in the multilateral community can keep the focus on and the pressure on governments to deliver, the better the chance there will be to actually see some results. We have two more speakers, and then I think I'll give Yorgos a chance, and then we'll move to the next topic. So our next speaker is Renata Giuliotti.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Former FOG Secretariat, so I have a lot of friend faces here. Now with the Collegian, I'm also a social science researcher, and I'm based now in New York, but I'm from Brazil. My supervisor is here, Slady Victor. So I want to advocate towards the people that are in the vulnerable groups and in the most remote areas, and how are they going to participate in the implementation of the pact? Because I think for now, it comes to us to have some sort of educational action towards the pact and telling these people that were not so involved before, but they could be more involved now and understand what the pact is all about, and that they would be able to push the pact towards their own member states. So it's up to us now to also have these educational action, I would call, sort of telling them what it is about and how they can act on it and monitor alongside with their civil society representations and with their member states. So how we promote this is very important, and how we use the communication in our favor to actually spread the word and make more things happen towards the social summit next year. We want to see more things happening towards the next summit and make good connections between the pact and the next summit, which will be a very important summit for human rights and for all of these vulnerable groups. So that was my contribution. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think some also excellent points there too about the importance, and I think many of us are in that business of raising awareness and advocacy, where we have a lot still to do. Then our last commentator, I'm very happy to give the floor now to Buyilewa Sonjika from South Africa.
Thank you very much for considering me. I am Buyilewa Sonjika, Deputy Chairperson of the Inclusive Society Institute in South Africa. I reside in Cape Town. I want to first commend all of the people that have been involved in the achievements that they have made thus far. I see a movement in what we have been trying to do, and it's appreciated. The researchers have done an excellent job, and what you have achieved at the summit was actually also very good. So I want to start there, but then I'm going to be all over because a number of issues have been raised. Firstly, we need to take what has been presented by the researchers and all the work that has been made done that far, as a springboard on which we are going to be building. This process is work in progress, and we will be building on this. And I must say that for me, the ground that has been covered is firm enough for us to move forward. And we need, therefore, to be conscious and intentional in our inputs in trying to take the process forward. That's my first comment. An issue was raised about mobilization of political support. And I want to link that up with what Mary was raising, reporting from the EU. And that approach that they've taken as the EU must be extended to other continents. we identify regions in those continents, because that is where you will get heads of states and countries represented. And it would, I think, in my view, it would be easier for you to galvanize political support from those structures. The other thing that I wanted to raise is I don't have a sense of the balance of forces in terms of the support. Those countries that are for, are they in the majority or are they in the minority? Because it means, therefore, that there's more work that still needs to be done. And we can be able to do that by looking at what the other countries. I have not been privy to the research. I've just, I had to listen to it as it was being presented. But there are quite a number of concerns that and wishes that countries are bringing up for our attention. The first one is the issue of inclusivity, which I think is a very important matter that we need to be looking at, especially when it comes to decision-making mechanism. If we could pay attention to that, because the issue with the Security Council has been decision-making and the power of the P5. So we need to focus on decision-making, because in a way, if we get it right there, then the issue of inclusivity, I think we would have gone a long way in addressing that. I think it goes together with the matter of equal partners. Some countries wanting to be equal partners. Again, it has to do with some countries having veto powers in the Security Council. So with this Resilience Council, we need to be aware that those are the things that have been discouraging countries at the Security Council. Those would be my few comments. I hope I'm making sense. Thank you very much.
Not to worry, Bulewa. You're definitely making sense. Thank you very much for that contribution. I think it was extremely helpful. And Yorgos, did you want to make some last comments before we wrap up this section?
Yes, Richard. Thank you very much, everybody, and also to our young researchers who presented the initial findings of their research. And we have to say that they're initial. There are requests in the chat to share the slides, and I think if they don't have any objection, we can do that if the researchers themselves have not any objection. But with a disclaimer that they are initial findings, the purpose is to have a final paper sometime in November, which will be more complete and will be issued as a Fox paper. So this is an initial presentation of their findings, the initial findings. And also, I would like to thank the colleagues who spoke before from all of them, but also civil society. We can see the two different poles in a way represented by Gonzalo and by Jeff and Eliane. We should find a way to work together, because there is a tension between being more bottom up and top down. There are two different approaches. Some of us try to do both, but if you stick to the UN environment in New York, sometimes you lose the connection to the real movements around the world. So, meaning we have to bring these two, I think, aspects and parts of civil society together. If we manage that, we would help a lot with the rebalancing of the whole system that's needed. The rebalancing, I think, did not happen. The hope, perhaps the intention of the Secretary General when he asked for this summit to take place through our Common Agenda report was the identification of this major new departure point for multilateralism. I think it is a stepping stone. We heard that before, but it's not the major departure in any way possible, because also of the wars that emerged in the meantime, the geopolitics that came back with a vengeance, and the P5 especially, and other big powers not wanting to cede any of their privileges. So we'll talk about this in the next part, but I think rebalancing the system to make the UN owned by the actual people and the states and the other actors, to drive really everybody's energies in the same direction and achieve the SDGs, achieve a lasting peace, and achieve human rights. That is still under, and still a big ask that we have to achieve together. So I think civil society can give a good example. I learned a lot from C4UN through our participation. I heard from them when things were happening, and participated with folks, colleagues in the consultations that the German and Namibian co-facilitators organized on the way to the Pact. But at the same time, that perhaps it was a bit too close to the Secretariat of the co-facilitators. We have to be a bit more critical as civil society. We have to acknowledge to member states their role. We see things disappeared from their initial proposals of the Secretary General because they were not well received by member states. So what we have now is 56 actions that are not very proactive, and I'm not sure how easy it will be to actually follow implementation of them because they're not very specific. But I will see the challenge with the C4UN colleagues, and then with Gonzalo, TNI, the South Center, also more emphasis on bringing in the Global South and the grassroots movements as co-owners of this effort, and not rushing ahead from a New York like central perspective, perhaps. I think, yeah, we could say more, but I think the next part will allow us also to discuss further. Thank you.
Thanks, Yorgos. As you were indicating, we can now move to the second topic, which I sensed from many of the interventions in the first round, people are very keen to talk about. I guess as many old institutional hands, it's something that there's great interest in and hope for. So we did see some, or we have seen in the last month, some advances in this area. I think it would be good to take stock and see how one can move this conversation forward. As a couple of you mentioned, this whole concept of inclusivity. So we'll start off as before with a short presentation from our researchers and associates who will give us a sense of where things are at. I understand Jonathan Santos will lead off this conversation. Jonathan.
Hey, Richard, yes, thank you. It's actually a topic that I like to talk about as well, because it involves peace and peace building and conflict prevention. As a primary body, the UN is responsible for maintaining international peace and security. The Security Council plays a crucial role in responding to global crises, conflicts, and emerging threats, as we know. The Pact for the Future emphasizes the need for reforming and strengthening this body to reflect current geopolitical realities, which is very important, that we were discussing previously. The Pact envisions a more inclusive, accountable, and transparent Security Council that can better address new global dynamics, including shifts in power and the rise of multipolarity. It calls for enhancing collaboration with regional organizations and other UN bodies to ensure a more comprehensive approach to peace building and conflict prevention. And here we had divided in teams. So team 1, addition for permanent members, reform of veto, and enhancement of geographical representation. And then in the next slide, I would like to comment. Here, there were 2 acts involved in the Pact, and Act 39 calls for a more representative, inclusive, transparent, efficient, democratic, and accountable Security Council. It advances a set of guiding principles for reform, including the proposition that any possible enlargement should redress the historic injustice against Africa and other unrepresented regional groups, and strike a balance between the goal of representativeness and effectiveness. And furthermore, the Pact also calls for agreement on the categories of the UN Security Council memberships, also in Actions 39, and on the scope and limits of the veto. Also, it could be found in Action 39. It also includes a provision to review periodically whether the Security Council is delivering on its mandate and remains fit for purpose. In a procedural development worth noting, the Pact authorizes the negotiations co-facilitators to consolidate a unified framework based on the different models of enlargement proposed by UN members. Additionally, the Pact calls for the implementation of the UN Charter provision, requiring countries involved in an armed conflict to refrain from voting resolutions seeking the pacific settlement on that dispute, which is, I think, currently it's very important. Ultimately, the Pact contains constructive language to endorse the UN General Assembly increase in activism on peace and security. And this includes instances when the UN Security Council's activity is paralyzed by the veto, encourage use of both the Uniting for Peace and veto initiative resolutions that can be found in Action 41. And now I pass on to Loreto that will continue on this topic.
Thank you. In our research findings, this was obviously the more contested point of our findings, which was all the commentary from the Global South, the Global North about the way forward for UN reforms. Many of the African countries, specifically, I will read a quote from Nigeria, felt that Africa has been ignored for far too long. The Deputy President of Nigeria delivered the president's speech at the summit, and he says that Africa must be accorded the respect that it deserves in the Security Council. Our continent deserves a place in the permanent members category of the Security Council with the same rights and responsibilities as other permanent members. We go to Japan, where they felt that the Summit of the Future is witnessing a classical, from multilateral actions and reform, with a majority supporting the expansion of both permanent and non-permanent seats. The one explicit action that did come out in relation to UNSC reforms was from the United States, a current UNSC member. However, it must be noted that explicitly this was a recommendation put forward by the United States unilaterally, and it wasn't a statement that came from the UNSC as a whole. The United States recommended that there should be 2 permanent member seats for Africa, 1 rotating seat for small island developing states, permanent representation for Latin America and the Caribbean, without the veto for all of them. It reiterated its support for permanent seats for Germany, Japan, and India. The United States supports starting negotiations on Council's reforms immediately. Within the African continent specifically, as this is really a matter that came out continuously throughout the research, where African countries felt as though there needs to be 2 seats designated to Africa, and they need to be able to have vetoing power. The challenge is going to be with a 54-member continent rather, which one of the 2 of these states is going to occupy the seat. There was another recommendation that had come out from the African Union as the continental body that wanted the African Union to have a permanent member seat on the UNSC and an additional African country. However, logistics around this are going to be slightly nightmarish. At present, the last statement that was delivered on Africa attaining a seat on the UNSC came from President Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa, who stated that there is currently a discussion going on within the African continent that the African Union should decide which of the 2 African member states should occupy the seat. However, there are very serious challenges around this, as they will be able to need, I believe it's over $20 billion per annum to finance their membership on the UNSC. And in addition to that, one of these 2 states, or both states rather, need to contribute 0.2% of their GDP towards defense. I will now hand over next to my colleague, Yuri.
Okay, thank you very much. From this slide, I'd like to talk about the veto reform. Only France, Liechtenstein, Norway, Mexico, New Zealand, and Turkey are mentioned at the general debate level. I'd like to see more specific reasons behind these member states from the next slide. Thank you. Here's a quote from the general debate. Each country on this map has almost a different perspective toward veto reform. For example, France, which has the right to veto, claims to regulate the use of the veto in case of the mass atrocities. However, Turkey is concerned that resolutions adopted by the General Assembly are being blocked by the veto in the Security Council. New Zealand has almost the same stance. Also, Mexico claims complete elimination of veto. Generally speaking, all of these countries are pointed out the ineffective situation of the Security Council right now and pressing need for the veto reform. Next slide, please. Thank you. From this slide, we'd like to talk about the geographical representation of the Security Council. Basically, they're developing countries like Africa, South Africa, Kenya, Namibia, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Southeast Asia, and some Middle East and Pacific countries. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a quote from General Debate. Countries like France and other African regions are calling for expanded membership of the African countries. For example, Namibia mentions that the current Security Council system does not represent African needs and aspirations. Namibia also emphasizes that what a Security Council should have been in 1945 is very different from right now. However, Tonga mentioned the expansion of small island developing states to reflect and address the unique and often overlooked vulnerabilities of the region, like the Blue Pacific. To sum up, developing countries are especially calling for the urgent need for geographical representation to increase their presence in the international society. Next section is handed over to Manam.
Thank you, Judy. So yes, the next and final topic of our presentation today is addressing the systemic crisis undermining the SDGs, or as we like to refer it at Fox, building global resilience. So on global resilience, the Pact lists 3 actions in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The actions are on the 43rd, which is on ECOSOC reform, the 54th, which is on strengthening international response to complex and global shocks, and the 55th, which says partnerships on both existing commitments by all member nations and addressing new challenges that are not quite known yet. So there's a lot to talk about on global governance beyond peace and security, but here we are focused on the global shocks, the situations which require urgent interventions and at a larger global scale. We did an interesting thing here, which is where we did some keyword analysis on the Pact to ascertain where the focus has been, what has been talked about briefly, and some major keywords which were omitted. So we start with the 3 pillars of the UN and the number of times they are mentioned. So peace and security was mentioned 35 times, sustainable development mentioned 89 times, and human rights 96 number of times. Next, the major issues which come under these pillars, the different means of solutions that come below that. So I'll start with the major issues. The peace was mentioned 28 times, disarmament 10, the SDGs 46 and 86 times. When I say SDGs 86 times, it also mentions specifically SDG 9 or SDG 6 or something here and there. And then climate change and climate action is mentioned 35 times. Health is mentioned 24 times, but there's an omission of any sort of pandemic. There is no talk about pandemic by using that word. The next we see that inequality is mentioned only 6 times, and poverty and hunger. Poverty again is being missed here. There's no mention of poverty, and then hunger is mentioned 7 times. Next, we have some of the means to solutions, right? So development assistance mentioned 6 times, financing for development or finance in general, financing was just mentioned 3 times, financing for development, and finance word has been used 103 times. Next, trade, investment, and debt, 11, 27, 15, as you can see. Capacity building, science and technology. So science and technology is mentioned a number of times, which is a good thing. And then finally we have the different organs of UN and how much mention did they get. So General Assembly, of course, was mentioned 28 times, the Security Council 22 times, and the Human Rights Council only once. ECOSOC was mentioned 7, which is abysmally low given that the importance that ECOSOC really has and how it has to be empowered for coming generations. On the left side, you can probably see the word cloud that we've made, which is what are the major words being highlighted in the Pact in the language that has been used. This is, of course, omitting the articles and small words. Oh yes, I forgot to mention resilience. So resilience is, I think, very important, which is what the entire focus is when you're looking beyond peace and security. What is global resilience? And so we try to look for resilience as well, and was mentioned 10 number of times. Next, on part of the countries, they reacted in very few numbers to global resilience or addressing these challenges. We only had a response from like 4 or 5 countries, what we found. Luxembourg said that we need to reform global financial system and increase climate financing. Brazil said that the General Assembly has lost its vitality and ECOSOC has been emptied. Tonga, on behalf of the Pacific Islands Forum, has innovated to build a regional resilience, including through the Pacific Resilience Facility. And I think they're suggesting that we have something of that sort at a global level. And with that, back to the chair for our discussion.
Thanks to all of you for, I think, a really good overview of what the situation is on institutional change. I'd now like to turn to the experts who've volunteered to comment on this, starting with Sukehiro Hasegawa from the Global Peacebuilding Association of Japan.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Richard Kinley. I'd just like to follow your suggestion. That is, you mentioned that folks' goal or objective is not just to study, but to act and make a difference. And I think you have been doing an excellent job in that. And for that matter, I think in the field of transforming the global governance, I think the first step and the most important step is the Security Council reform. And we should perhaps go beyond the quick solutions in a short time. You cannot have a Security Council reform in just 1, 2, or 5 years or 10 years. So I think we have a golden opportunity by the inability of IGN, intergovernmental negotiations, to go beyond what they have agreed. I think they have done an excellent job over the last 20 years. It took 20 years to come to common understanding that the U.S. ambassador to UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, I met him in New York, in Tokyo when he came here, and she confirmed and she delivered her speech at the Council of Foreign Affairs, that the U.S. is, at least the Biden administration is ready to accept some sort of Security Council reform. But what she made, the proposal, is a proposal basically that is reasonable for those who are in power. I think it would be just additional power to be given to the Western powers, and one exceptional case, in the case of U.S. ambassador saying it's India. I think there is almost universal consensus that India deserves a permanent seat. But the US opposed Brazil for the ideological reasons, and China and Russia opposed Japan and Germany to be added. So it's a non-starter, I'm afraid, that the G5, G4 plus US proposal. And secondly, I think we should be aware that all other proposals made by African C10, G group of 69 India is heading, Caribbean proposal and so forth, except for one thing that all the country agrees, is that Security Council seat should be, can be increased by 10 or 11 if this small island countries want to, can prevail. Now, I think we should take this on top of it as a way to bring about a real Security Council reform in 2 stages. One, next year, that is the 80th anniversary of UN. And we had this Pact for the Future tabled, the agreement that have been reached. Let's move on that and make the Security Council more representative, inclusive, and somewhat more accountable. How can we do it? We cannot aspire to abolish veto power. I think we should not just dream something. Remember, all the dictators never gave up what they had, unless the Louis XVI, for example, was brought to guillotined. Remember? So how can we do it? I think we can do it in a 20-year span. And if Mr. Richard Kinley, if you can succeed in making Secretary General Guterres to think that he deserves something which other Secretary General has had. Remember, we still talk about Kofi Annan with his enlarger freedom. And we talk about Plan A and Plan B, and Mexico certainly goes for the Plan B and uniting for consensus, coffee clubs, yes. But their recommendation is good, but their motive is not good. You have to align the motive and outcome of their proposals. And here, only Secretary General can do so, because IGN got stuck, because it's not the G5 countries or privileged countries, but all other countries want to keep their national, so-called national interest. In other words, Africans want 2 seats, permanent seats, they said. Now, Africans deserves proper representation, but I think they should not keep their dream as something, as a condition for UN Security Council reform. And I think here, my suggestion is for folks to send a petition to the Secretary General that he has 2 more years and he can leave a legacy that will make us remember him for the next 20 years by just making one concrete concrete initial Security Council reform. That is, add the 10 5-year renewable seats.
Thank
None
you.
of them.
Oh,
okay. Yeah,
thank you for that. Thank you for that concrete suggestion. At first, I thought you were leading us towards a guillotine for the Secretary General, but no, even better, legacy. So I think, I mean, it's these sort of ideas about how we can take the current situation and try to move forward are quite valuable. So our next commentator would be Uyewa Sonjika. Uyewa, please.
Thank you very much. Richard, I did not sponsor, but I will speak. I just, I'm sure it's a legacy hand that you see there. I just have one point to make, maybe from an observation, that the transformation of the United Nations, especially using the Pact as a source, has now emerged as two-dimensional. There is the idea of the creation of the Global Resilience Council, which in my view is a slightly different structure that would be dealing with matters non-military. And there is the issue that falls within the global governance, which is the matter of the United Nations Security Council, especially after the input that has been made by researchers and all. My question then, Richard, is, are we going to be dealing, well, I'm associating myself with folks as part of this team. Shall we be looking at all of this, or are we going to be focusing specifically on the creation of the Global Resilience Council? It's a question, and at the same time, I'm raising a concern that maybe it would take too long for us to achieve. And what if we were to take everything all at once? And I mean, it means then that would the status quo would continue, and all of the challenges that we have on matters of development, climate change, and everything else falling within the non-military, then will be affected as it is affected at present. So as I say, I'm raising a question, but at the same time, I am raising a concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Difficult concern. I think we may take a crack at answering that after we've heard from a few more speakers. But clearly, the appetite in the international community for major institutional reform at the time of the summit was limited, shall we say. I think we at FOGS continue to believe in the solidity of our proposal for a Global Resilience Council, but that did not find its way into the outcome. And I'm a great believer in a good idea will find its home at the right time. So I think we need to see if at some point the international community will come to see that this idea of having a mechanism to address non-security crises is something that merits further consideration, and then the work that we had done could be brought again to the fore. We had one more person who'd indicated that they were interested to make a thought-provoking kickoff statement, and that is from the Coalition for the UN We Need, Mr. Isan Shah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to speak. And thank you so much to the researchers for that excellent presentation. I think that gave us a very comprehensive overlook about what the situation is on Security Council reform. I think it's something that a lot of us have been looking at for many, many years in terms of how do we re-envision the Security Council to respond to the crises of today and tomorrow more effectively. And I think it's a tough conversation. I think in spaces like this, we can often get caught up in the language of these resolutions of this IGN process and forget about, the reality of why do we need Security Council reform? I mean, if we look at the geopolitical fragmentation that we're existing in, if we look at the escalating conflicts and crises that are occurring across the world in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ukraine, the legacies of the impacts of conflict in Afghanistan and the impact that's having on human rights as well. I mean, that's the principle of why we need Security Council reform, right? At the end of the day, we have to look beyond the words that are on the paper and look at what are the people that are being impacted by this reform. And I say this because for those of us who have been following the IGN process, and for those of us who have actually been able to sit inside the IGN process too, it is so detached from the reality of what is happening on the ground and the urgency of why Security Council is needed, and the urgency and the reason why many of us as civil society are pushing so hard for Security Council reform. It's because with every day we delay, the impact that it's having on the ground, on the people, is tremendous. It's insurmountable. The millions and millions of people, the unfathomable amount of people that are being impacted by the power play that member states are having in the IGN process, in the room, in New York. And that's also very disturbing as well, having sat in the IGN process, is this lack of civil society engagement. It is a member state-driven process. The doors are closed. The people are kicked out of the room. And it's the member states talking about amongst themselves. And the things they're saying are very, very crude. It's very, very much so one state saying, we cannot have this member state be a permanent member of the Security Council. It's very, very prescriptive, the power play that's happening. And that's having a tremendous impact. And we've seen the impact that a lack of civil society participation has on intergovernmental processes. We've seen that in this Pact for the Future process too. The Pact for the Future is not what we wanted. And that is down to the fact that civil society were not meaningfully included in the negotiations in that process at all. We cannot have those same mistakes be repeated in the Security Council process where the outcomes of the IGN seek comfort in agreed language. As many of the speakers have mentioned before, this is an opportunity to look at the Security Council in a new light and to really ensure that it delivers for the people who the Security Council is supposed to serve, not for the member states and not for those in power. So I think that's the key element that I wanted to raise today, is the fact that a lot of us talk about Security Council reform in an echo chamber. We talk about it amongst people who already, are very for Security Council reform, who know what we're talking about, who have studied what reform could look like and who are following this process very closely. So this is a call to action as well in terms of the fact that we need to be talking to others on Security Council reform, to other sort of sectors and other people working within the UN space, but also at a capital level. We have to be talking to our ministries of foreign affairs, our ministries of defense, to the decision makers who are the ones who are feeding missions in New York the information. Because when you talk about Security Council reform, immediately people would start to disassociate because it becomes something that's so unachievable, so unattainable, something that's looking so far into the future. But the reality is we need that shift now because there is a sense of urgency to it. So I think those are the points I wanted to raise in particular, but also the fact that we need to start socializing what Security Council reform really means and looks like to other movements and other people in the civil society space and really bring them on board too. It can't just be a community of 10, 15 organizations who are focusing on it, but it's got to be a very big global push. And particularly in countries who hold the P5 seat, who hold the veto, and those who are really pushing back on the reform that we need. Apologies if those thoughts were slightly disassociated or distangled, but I hope that made sense, and I really value this space. I'm learning a lot, so thank you very much for inviting me in.
Thank you, Ishan, for those thoughts. I think in particular, it provoked in me a couple of thoughts. One was, it's some reluctance come back to flogging our own idea, the FOG's idea of the Global Resilience Council, but there we did have some new and innovative ideas, I think, about how civil society could be more effectively engaged in institutions, which could then echo into wider Security Council discussions. But secondly, you were speaking about the depth of the crises that need to be, that a Security Council reformed and strengthened needs to address. I think for me, there's one other issue, which is the idea of ownership. One needs to build in the international community a wider sense that this institution is not just a few countries, but there is an ownership for the Security Council and the concept of security. And when so many people are excluded, I think that ownership is weakened. So it's simply a supplement to the point that you were making about the importance of these reform conversations. Now I'd like to invite anyone else. We have 10 or 15 minutes for this portion of the conversation. If anyone wanted to make some comments, we'd be happy to hear those now if you could use your raise hand button. Give a moment for that. I hope that's not indicative of institutional reform fatigue, but I guess we can't rule it out at the also end of a longer conversation. Okay, Buye Wasojika, I see you'd like to come in again, please.
Thank you, Richard. But let me thank you for your facilitation, which was excellent as well. And I hope that this is not the last meeting or engagement on this. I want to suggest that we find a way of popularizing this conversation. I think we are at a point where we can be able, led by folks, to engage globally and publicly. I think it would go a long way in terms of speeding up the process, if I may put it that way, because it would be out there, public and popular, in my view. So I'm trying to say, let's bring in it's time to bring in the media. And of course, I have another wild idea, Richard, that maybe think of a champion that would be a face or a figure. It could be yourself, it could be a former president, it could be anyone that we think that has a stature that would fit that a kind of responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Buneo, for those suggestions, which we've taken. I think the idea of a champion in particular is something that would be along with the Secretary General's legacy concept, would be things which we could work on and develop in hopes that they could help advance the conversation. I see Daniel Perel. Daniel, welcome. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks so much. And you know, a number of my colleagues have spoken before, but I thought I'd just take the floor because there's a question that's been on my mind, and I wonder how we plan to address it, which is quite simply that any idea, good or bad, right or wrong, if proposed by country A, will be opposed by country B. That's sort of the world in which we live right now, this profound rivalry. And it'll be opposed by country C and endorsed by country D, and you end up creating these groupings, these factions. And you know, based on what Ishan said and what many others have spoken of, this is about something quite profound. It's not just about the number of seats at a table, but it's about a rules-based order. It's about ensuring that human lives can be well lived. And I wonder what points of consensus we can find from which we can build. Because if we come at this, and this is one of the challenges I see with civil society, with a firm position of what needs to be, then sure, we may get some member states on our team, but then are we not reinforcing some of these same divisions? In other words, how do we present these ideas, these aspirations in a way that can win the consensus or win the support of any different grouping at the UN? And I don't know the answer to this, but I do think that as the world becomes more polarized, we have to become wiser with our approaches and our advocacy. And I'm not sure how to do it, but I can't think of a better group to help me think through this idea. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. I really like that idea of starting from where are points of agreement, and to see if in that way one could build a constituency and a conversation that would gradually move forward towards points of consensus. As Mr. Hasagama was saying, this may take a bit of time, but it does take work. I mean, it takes work, thinking, and conversation, and perhaps those of us who are interested in these topics and committed to them from civil society can help advance that conversation with governments to get to the place where we need to be.
Yeah.
Mr. Hasagawa.
Yeah. Yes, very much. Thank you. No, I think you are quite right. And thank you so much for stressing that. I like to just build on Daniel's excellent point. Let's build on the consensus that government so far reached. As I mentioned, that they have agreed to increase 10 to 11 seats to the Security Council. Okay, but they haven't agreed on the content, which region and whether the permanent seat or non-permanent seat. I think we have to first make the G4 countries to be more future oriented, that their power can be kept as they pose themselves, not in the same way. Asking for the permanent seat is going back. We don't need more security permanent seats. I think we are going to help the emergence of the new global governance structure, as Boutros Ghali was saying. You remember what he said in Agenda for Democratization, which he published 2 days after Christmas? Only non-Christian can do that kind of thing. And his term was not extended. But he wanted the democratical process system of the not just country, but the international community. And let's move that. That is the right thing. And we cannot do it in 1-2 years. It takes 20 years, or maybe 50 or 100 years. And let's remember, I appreciate Briera and also Ishahan. But look, we are talking about power grabbing, power keeping, and you have to make the Putin agree. You have to make these power holders to agree, and they are agreeing more or less to increasing the seats, but they don't want any more Security Council permanent seats. Do you know which countries are really opposing among the G4? Brazil recognized, with the United States against it, they will not get it. Japan and Germany realized that China and Russia opposes it. But it's India. India wants it, and India thinks India can get it if you insist on it. And the Africans, I think they're dreaming it. They don't know which country. I mean, Egypt cannot agree, Nigeria and South Africa. and South Africa doesn't agree that Kenya and Egypt should get. Let them say they have 5 years, and after 5 years, they can stay on. They can be re-elected, but it's up to the international community or up to the African community. I don't want to go too long, but I think let's find a formula, and only the Secretary General can do, because all the member states they are prisoners of their Westphalia mentality, territory, and their national sovereignty, and that should be permanent. You see what I mean? That
Yes.
we have to now move around.
Great. Thank you. We have one last comment, who I would ask to help me meet my commitment to end on time by being as brief as possible, and that's Arthur Dow.
Thank you. Responding to Daniel's question and a bit also Sukihiro's last comment, we're stumbling over the problem of national sovereignty, which is at the core of the charter as it's defined. But we can't simply throw it out without offering something better in its place. And so if we can work on a charter of rights of national autonomy, what are those things that need to be dealt with in diverse ways, in diverse situations, cultural situations, reflecting the diversity of the world, but to reassure them that what's really important to them is not absolute sovereignty, but the freedom to resolve our global problems collectively in ways that respect our differences and our rich diversity. And so maybe if we can work on a better definition of what might replace national sovereignty at the core of the Charter, with a set of of rights that would be encouraging what are the good things that need to be protected by each country. That will then open the possibility to set aside absolute sovereignty and address some of these political issues more easily. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. I mean, it reminds me of the concept that with rights come responsibilities, and they need to be balanced. Yorgos, a final word, and then we'll come to a wrap up.
Thank you, Richard. And thanks to everybody. As you said before, sovereignty can be redefined and has been redefined. I'm like a historian of the UN now, with my PhD and everything. Like sovereignty as responsibility, right? Not only responsibility to protect people, but responsibility to deliver the SDGs and everything for the state and its citizens. So we cannot do away with the state. We want to build the state. That's the funny thing I think that we are missing sometimes. Some of us in the civil society seem like we want to demolish the state, but we do want to rebuild it rather. We want it to be able to deliver services, like we want the UN to be able to deliver services, not to dominate the lives of individuals and not respect their rights, but to give all the framework and the basic utilities and other things that are needed for a good life, for well-being. So sovereignty is responsibility, and sovereignty as sovereign equality is also important, because in the past at the UN, a lot of times Security Council or other ways were found to intervene in countries and to allow the big powers to play roles that were dominating, but not necessarily for the common good. So that's when you need, at the level of states, there has to be a sense of equality. When you go to the collective organs like the Security Council, hopefully a Global Resilience Council for non-military threats, there you could have a kind of compulsory measures, but to allow big powers or to allow now civil society to erode state responsibility by playing a bit a game which is more closer to one or the other side, I think that's not responsible from our side. There is work for everybody. We can do a lot, like for the G4 that Sukihiro Hasegawa mentioned. If we see now Japan and Germany coming out as not really demanding a permanent seat because they are not at the peak of their power, even if they realize it, they can be very helpful middle powers and accept this renewal of re-election like semi-permanent seats. That would allow the Security Council, I think, reform to go further ahead instead of trying to see who will get them in Africa and here and there and everybody blocking each other. Other things that we can do very briefly is, I think we have to be aware a bit as civil society, what is our legitimacy, what is the transparency of our own actions, and how faithful we are done to each other. We had a pact, a People's Pact for the Future, suddenly changed and became something else. We had agreed on some proposals, something else was afterwards deposited. So there is a lot of goodwill and confidence building even within civil society. I think it's a good start, the discussion. Thanks a lot. We can bring it to the press. We can take it further among ourselves. I hope that Richard and Yoriko, we may hear here also, and everybody from Fox and everybody here will remain engaged. Not to rush each other, because we, thank God, we don't have exactly the limits that we had with Summit of the Future. Take it easy, but be systematic and not have double standards ourselves, be transparent, think of our legitimacy, which is not unquestionable, and try to do our part as best as we can, and let the other actors do their part also. Thank you.
Thanks, Yorgos. Definitely food for thought. We're coming to the end of our allotted time. So before wrapping up, I wanted to give a chance for a final comment to my colleague and friend Yoriko Yasakawa to say a few words at the closing.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, everyone. First of all, very heartfelt thanks and congratulations to the team of young people for their work. I think it was a great help what you did in understanding what came out of the summit and what's being discussed around the Security Council reform, especially for those of us who have not followed these processes quite as closely as you have. But also for those who have, in terms of ordering and systematizing an enormous amount of information and ideas coming out of these discussions. And it's also really wonderful to see such a hugely diverse group of people working together to produce something constructive, and also to see that your generation has not given up on the UN. And it reminded me of a comment I heard many years back from a Guatemalan friend shortly after a peace accord was signed that ended many decades of a really brutal civil war. And he said to me, as important as the content of an agreement is just the fact that people with conflicting views have found common ground and agreed to something. So I think it's important to remember that when we get too pessimistic about the Pact for the. Also, thank you to the commentators for sharing their very diverse opinions and ideas and doing so in a constructive manner toward moving these processes toward building a better United Nations. And I just wanted to share also a couple of reflections. I'm sure a lot of us have seen and heard, both in the media and from friends and acquaintances, very skeptical comments about the summit and the UN in general. It's related also to what Ishan was saying about, with so many terrible crises the world is facing, and the United Nations showing itself unable to respond effectively to these crises as it is, what good is all of this talk? So I think we do need to think about how to articulate to the world at large why these debates and proposals are important, and how they contribute toward making the UN more effective in building a more peaceful and just world. And I think that's important also for what Yerwa was saying about popularizing the discussion. And speaking of crises, I also wanted to mention that a group of former UN staff members just issued a call for an end to the violence in the Middle East. So maybe, I don't know, Yorgos or Manan can share the link to the statement in the chat. And finally, having spent decades inside the UN system and gone through multiple iterations of reform attempts, I think one thing that we need to be wary of is not to confuse the means with the ends. And I say this because so often in these processes, we end up obsessing over the instruments for change and losing sight of the ultimate objectives they were meant to serve. And these instruments, whether they were new procedures or structures or mechanisms, ended up being sort of the ends in themselves. And so sometimes maybe it's important to ask ourselves, what do we really want to achieve? And maybe that can help us get over our differences over the means. So let's keep our eyes on the prize. And thanks again to everybody and good luck.
Thank you, Yuriko, for those remarks, which I think really helped to bring together some of the points today and allow us to close on an optimistic note. I would repeat Yuriko's reference to the recently published, or today published on UN Day, call to end violence in the Middle East now and for good, and draw your attention to it. Either, I'm not sure if it's been able to be posted. It is, if you don't see it in the chat, on the UNF, on the FOG's website. And it's now open to all, not just former UN staff members, anyone who wishes to give their support to this announcement, to this call. With that, I would add my voice to Yorgos and Yuriko, thanking you all for your participation today. I wish you strength and goodwill in your ongoing work on these issues that we've been speaking about, and hope that we can continue to work together and to collaborate to ensure the kind of strong and effective UN that we all would like to see. And with that, I wish you all a happy and hopeful UN Day.